I was thinking a little bit along the lines of one of the questions yesterday evening with the readings just after tea time, early evening readings. Was a question that Aaron brought up about different qualities, different faculties of the mind, aspects of the mind, some being, say, these are my words more, I think, more on a shallow level versus those that are on a deeper level, and discerning which kinds of faculties or qualities of the mind are more deeper and long-lasting and in the long term affecting us versus more shallow, or not, maybe shallow is not such a good word, but more expendable aspects of the mind, particularly like those that are related to the brain or the function of the intellect. And Luang Por talked about that, those various different aspects of mind, the ones that are more deeply embedded and the ones that are more subject to rapid change. And I like to reflect on those a lot, because a lot of the time we get really wrapped up in the more surface qualities of mental activity and imbue them with a sense of solid reality that kind of just really get lost and enmeshed in those more surface type mental faculties, mental experiences. And if we absorb into them in that way, then they kind of hide in some way the deeper mental qualities that are actually driving the whole scene, steering the whole scene of our experience on a much deeper and sometimes more subtle level. So the more surface ones of the intellect, and I think one can roughly, although there's a lot of overlap and influence, one can roughly talk about these in using the terms, the two terms that are often both translated as mind, both Chitta and mano, or manas. The latter, mano, manas, being the Pali words for the intellect, sort of the aspect of mind that is involved more with functionality, classification of our experience, abstraction, conceptualization, analysis, the world of ideas, concepts, plans, all those kinds of mental functions that are quite dependent on the brain and having a functional brain as well. And then the more subtle or affective qualities or experiences of Chitta, heart/mind, kind of the more the deep, what I just referred to, rightly or wrongly, as the deeper level of mental experience that is very reflective in its quality, so that whatever tendencies or mental inclinations are coursing through, that becomes the quality of our deeper experience of our heart, mind, Chitta. So those qualities being things like the anusaya, the underlying tendencies that we have, more or less along the lines of the rebirth-causing ones like greed, hatred, delusion, lobha, dosa, moha, and its kind of more concrete manifestations, like the hindrances, sense desire, ill will, dullness, drowsiness, agitation, restlessness, anxiety, fear, confusion, doubt, wavering, all these kinds of affective states that are just more manifestations of those three root underlying tendencies. And other ways that those tendencies and faculties tend to manifest in the heart, kind of driving the undercurrent of our experience, steering our attention and our the way we are in the world, the way we pattern our world based on those. Also, kind of the place or the experience where good qualities of a deeper nature arise and manifest too, depending on how we pay attention to them, how we support them. All the good qualities of kindness and generosity and virtue and generosity, all the paramitas that we develop to help steer the mind in more wholesome directions that lead less to suffering. So these are, when I think about it anyway, these are kind of the different qualities that are much longer term in directing our experience than, say, the mental faculties of mano, manas, the intellect. And oftentimes, it comes up in discussions of rebirth, and of course one can look in terms of rebirth as the process of one life to another lifetime, or in the process of this one singular lifetime. It's all the same process, just the time span is different. And so it kind of kind of reminds me of that classic question, that people pose to the Buddha in different ways of referring to the teaching on anatta when the question comes up. Oh, well, if there's no self, then what is it that gets reborn? And the ways that the various ways that the Buddha answered or didn't answer that, because it's actually the way that it's often questioned in that way is presumes kind of a reality that doesn't actually exist. The question is not a valid question in a sense, and the Buddha points that out in different ways. You can't, when you say something like, if there is no self, what is it that is reborn? Inherent in that question is the assumption that there is an it. And perhaps a better way to phrase the question is what is it that drives rebirth? What is how does rebirth happen? What is the process that drives rebirth, rather than what is reborn? And it brings it into more of an active process, an event rather than anything, which is, I think, a very useful way to contemplate this, particularly in our own experience, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a contemplative So in different ways, I think the Buddha points to this process of this momentum of mind that's fueled by these underlying tendencies that I was mentioning before, the deeper underlying mental activities that occur in our awareness, in our mind, our heart, fueled by these tendencies towards greed, hatred, delusion, confusion, and all of their manifestations, and also can be steered by those more wholesome qualities, including wisdom, discernment. But it's this momentum that's fueled by these underlying tendencies that is kind of the energy in the rebirth process. The tendencies, those underlying tendencies and good qualities kind of are the fuel, but then there's this energetic propulsion of the mind that keeps on manifesting. And I think, in some ways, the word sankhara is a useful way to think of that mental momentum, the process of fabrication, that kind of energetic. Ajahn Sucitto often refers to sankhara as like the energetic momentum that keeps on fueling, or is the process by which these underlying tendencies just keep on manifesting. When we have the basic underlying condition of ignorance, ignorance of how this whole system works, backed up by its nutriments of the hindrances and these manifestations of underlying tendencies, then there arises this momentum to start fabricating, to start creating our experience based on these underlying tendencies that are in charge and taking control of the whole process. The confusion, the delusion, the wanting, the aversion takes hold and starts to use this process of fabrication to start creating a reality for us. So this is, picking up sort of a little from the themes of dependent origination, with ignorance as a basis, fueled by these hindrances and underlying qualities, that this momentum starts to pick up. Intention starts to arise to seek a place to manifest, to fabricate, to formulate. And then it uses, and then consciousness, conscious awareness picks up on that and starts to move into the experience of the sense bases. This is vijnana, divided knowing. This awareness starts to divide into where it can land, where it can manifest in the body or the mind, the nama rupa, the body and the mind and its 6 sense bases, where it can individuate into sights and sounds and all the experiences of the body, all the experiences of the mind, the intellect, the nama rupa, and start to seek their gratification or get entangled with confusion. All these underlying tendencies start to try and fabricate and manifest experience through the body and the mind. And then it kind of, the momentum picks up and we start experiencing all the various ways of contact with the world around us through those sense bases and the feelings that arise from them and the craving and that arises based on that, the identification with, the solidification around, the really gelling into a holding on to, and then the process of becoming, where the I-making and the mind-making, the sense of self starts to grow and solidify around all of these experiences, this absorption into experience and reality. And then, as you all know, the birth, whether it's birth in this moment of experience, this birth over and over again, moment after moment, based on this process, or the birth of an actual physical body when that process occurs at the end of one life, moving into the beginning of another life experience, and all the dukkha that arises based on that whole process. So it's kind of, it's these underlying tendencies, these deeper states that drive the force, the manifestation of this energetic process of becoming. And that's why it's so important to pay attention to them and not to get too concerned about the more surface qualities of the mind that, which we can get very wrapped up in when we see our cognitive faculties declining, or we identify strongly with the operations of the intellect. And as we get older or have illness and those faculties start to decline, we kind of get wrapped up in those, concerned with those, because we've identified with them so much. So many times you hear that people say, "Oh well, I can understand and be accepting of the fact that my body will get old and deteriorate, get sick, and that I won't be able to be as strong as I used to be, or be able to do the things physically that I used to be able to do. But I don't want to lose control over my mind." I mean, those intellectual properties. That would be, a fate worse than death, in a sense, if I wasn't able to think clearly, or if my memory was gone, or I, just wasn't able to operate with full cognitive abilities. But it's going to happen, so might as well get used to it. Sometimes people are lucky and stay pretty bright and sharp right up till the very end, but for most of us, there's going to be some sort of decline in those, just as a natural part of natural law of having a human body. But these underlying tendencies, these underlying states that drive us into this continual moment-to-moment sense of being a solid, permanent, or at least with a continuity entity, a being. These things that keep on driving that process are something that we can learn to understand, not be fooled by, and eventually uproot the unskillful ones that lead to this constant state of rebirth and suffering. So it's a good distinction to be made, and I was glad that Aaron asked that question. I think it's a very important consideration to really learn which of these qualities we can work with, which ones we have the ability to kind of understand and see how they create this whole realm, in a sense, the realm of our existence. And so you can kind of see when you reflect on this process too, that like this whole cycle, the stages of dependent origination. I think one of the primary things that are understandings, realizations that come from really looking at this over and over again. And again, not just as an intellectual exercise, but as a way of analyzing or interpreting one's own experience, is that you see kind of the selfless nature of it. It's meant to describe a process that is devoid of any being, one person who is creating or controlling or experiencing this process. It's a cycle that constantly replays itself over and over again, but it is devoid of any kind of controlling self nature. So I think it's very much plays into the whole contemplation of anatta. They're tightly woven in with each other. In fact, all three characteristics really are woven into this impersonal process of how the world of fabrications come to arise, how our experience arises based on these tendencies. And it's worthy of reflecting over and over again on how to use it as a contemplation for understanding the perception of self, the perception of not self. One of the other questions that came up yesterday's reading with Ratapala, I think it might have been Eric who brought up the question of we, the use of we versus I in when Ratapala was talking to his father, and I was thinking about that a little bit too, and we were trying to contemplate what the reasoning behind his use of that plural form in reference to himself, where that was, whether it was possibly an idiomatic way of expressing that sense of, referring to oneself at that time. And I don't think it's probably the reason why he might have chosen a word, but it started getting me thinking that actually it might be a very skillful way to refer to oneself, because actually there's a lot of selves in one person. Yeah, often, it's referred to by some of our teachers as the committee members in our minds, the committee, all the different voices that we hear inside of ourselves that we take to be who we are at any one particular moment, and how many there are, and how they're just reflections of the current tendencies that are manifesting in our minds. So you have the self, or the voice of the critical, blaming being, self, who's fault-finding, or either with oneself or with other people, or involved with some sort of story of anger, based in anger, or judgment, or self-righteousness, those kinds of things, indignation, or the greedy, wanting, or jealous being who's manifesting at any one particular time, and talking loudly, and then the other one that responds with saying, "Be quiet. I don't want to be that kind of person. I shouldn't be that way." So they each kind of react to each other, generate upon each other, and we've got so many different, the fearful selves, the anxious selves, so many different little beings inside each one of us, that maybe it's a very useful, proper way to refer to our experience with the use of the word we or us rather than I. But to really start to question, this I-making, this my-making, and see how that kind of solidification into identification is just another layer of pain that we add to the already painful experiences that we go through in the perceptual realm. So the whole contemplation of anatta, we have in the chanting, in the morning chanting, the reflections in the Triple Gem, Sabbe Dhamma Anatta, and it's translated as, as one of our reflections, and it's translated in the book anyway as there is no self in the created or the uncreated. And I've often contemplated that. It's not that it's a bad translation or inaccurate in sort of ways, but what I find it tends to do is it tends to make the teaching on anatta sort of into a doctrine, or almost like a metaphysical declaration. There is no self in the created or the uncreated. And I'm not sure that, at least from what my understanding is that, the Buddha didn't really try and make categorical metaphysical statements about the existence of self or the non-existence of self, because it's really clear that there is at least a perception of self that feels quite real. So to categorically say there is no self seems to be a little bit of a misrepresentation of what our experience tells us, at least in the realm of perception, that there is this perception that we carry around with us of self. And as with all perceptions, it's a real experience, but it is not anything that is substantial or permanently abiding, or anything that's going to be satisfactory in any way whatsoever. But there is this perception of not-self. So I think that a better translation, at least for contemplating, is instead of there is no self in the created or the uncreated, it's more like all dhammas are not self. Which has a different quality to it. It brings it more into the realm of contemplative strategy, so that we can look at all of those things that we overlay with this perception of me or mine and take ownership with and cling to. It's the clinging to these five khandhas with this overlay of the perception of self that causes so much suffering, tightness and narrowness of our experience. And if we can use it as a contemplative strategy rather than as a doctrine to try and understand, then I think that's a really skillful use of the teaching on anatta. So that, and it's clear in many different ways how the Buddha uses that, particularly, like as we all know, from the Anatta Lakkhana Sutta, where it goes through each of the five khandhas. Form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, mental formations are not self, consciousness is not self. That it's a contemplative strategy that is meant to unentangle our involvement and our belief in that self-perception, kind of to slowly tease us apart from that, so that we don't operate from that I-making and my-making on a continuous basis. Get little glimpses into this kind of impersonality of the phenomena of existence and how it manifests with these underlying tendencies. So as you know, we're in this retreat time, and little by little, hopefully, our verbal faculties, the vaci sankara, the thinking mind, is maybe just slowing down, just a trickle, a little bit, and kind of disengaging from a lot of stimulation. We've got a lot of space and time in the retreat here, and that's what it takes to be able to start seeing these processes and starting to let them unravel a bit, because we can put so much emphasis in trying to become something, this becoming process, and there are certain wholesome qualities that we do want to bring into being, in a sense, to help nourish and support our understanding and reduce our suffering. And we also need to realize that it's kind of the disentangling or the defueling, the unfueling of this process that actually starts to lead to real deeper senses of peace that's based on cessation, relinquishment. It's like, if we can identify and experience these underlying tendencies on a much more deeper felt level, experience level, rather than on a conceptual level, then we'll start to learn how to disentangle ourselves from those qualities. It's like driving a car. You have a tank full of fuel, but if you don't keep putting fuel in the car, then it eventually will run out of gas. It'll stop, and the momentum of the car will carry on for a little while, and then it stops because there's no fuel anymore. And it's this defueling of our onward going momentum. If we start to just not feed it anymore with these underlying tendencies, the craving, the desires, the aversions, the confusion. If we stop that process through conscious recognition of how they manifest and what contributes to their arising, and how to provide little ways, antidotes to stop feeding the process, then the momentum that comes from that will just start to slowly peter out. We don't have to create all sorts of new ways of being other than those ones that are supportive of that defueling process. So recognizing how it works, and then just stopping the fueling process and allowing it to subside and to result in this ability to clearly see, to clearly understand, so that we become disenchanted, so that we don't keep feeding it. We become dispassionate towards the whole process, and we allow this pure, unadulterated quality of unobstructed awareness to just be in that way. We are with that and not entangled in all of the objects that are coursing through it. So that's what the retreat time, I think, is very useful for, to just be able to slow down and reflect and see these processes happening, these deep underlying mental states, and the confusion they cause us, and how to deconfuse ourselves from the whole entangled, messy situation. That's what the teachings are gearing us towards, and which are aiming us towards in in this process. So I think I'll just leave it there. A few rambling thoughts from some of the talks we've had recently.